Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt, DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. The London skyline would not be complete without the Neo-Gothic Palace of Westminster, the meeting place of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Today, curator and historic buildings preservationist Annie Kemkaran-Smith will explore the past, present, and future of the iconic Houses of Parliament, including the origins of the palace and the beginnings of parliamentary government in England, the architectural development and historical figures that shaped the current Houses of Parliament, and the planned restoration and renewal program of the buildings for the next 50 years. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. And we apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. Even if you do lose connection, you will receive an email with a full recording linked on our website that will enable you to watch the presentation at any time. And speaking of people coming in from home, Annie's actually joining us today from Malta. I mean, how about that? Annie is a curatorial and heritage professional who spent 15 years as a curator with English Heritage, where she was in charge of the Down House, the home of Charles Darwin, and Eltham Palace, a magnificent Tudor 1930s country house outside London. In 2015, Annie completed a tenure as curator for the US Embassy in London, caring for the art collection there and at the ambassador's residence, Winfield House in Regent's Park. After this, she served as head curator at Leeds Castle in Kent and as a consulting curator for the restoration of the Houses of Parliament. For the last 3 years, Annie has been an independent consultant, offering advice and guidance to private owners to help care for their collections. Today, as I mentioned, Annie joins us from Malta, where she is working on assessing some of the historic sites and collections on this famous home of the Knights Templar. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful and great fun that is Annie.
Curt, thank you so much. What a lovely introduction, and I'm so pleased to be able to talk to you this evening, as it is for me, because it is just gone 7 p.m. in Malta. I flew in this morning, and it's a rather lovely island, so I highly recommend it if any of you ever get the chance. But I am here today for you guys to talk to you about the Palace of Westminster, or the Houses of Parliament as we probably know it better today. So the Houses of Parliament, as we know them today, form one of the most iconic scenes in London, and images of this building, as you can see here on the screen, are instantly recognisable around the globe as the centre of lawmaking and democracy in the UK. However, the name that we give them, the Houses of Parliament, is actually only describes a few key chambers within that complex of buildings, namely the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and the Royal Gallery. And so the much wider complex of spaces actually replaced a much older building, which was called the Palace of Westminster. And nowadays, the whole complex is still referred to as the Palace of Westminster by historians, rather than the Houses of Parliament. What you can see in the image here was actually erected in 1837 as a new set of buildings in a Gothic style that reference the long history of the site and its functions, while also looking forward into the future of what was then at the time the peak of the British Empire. As you look at this image, make note of the building's position and how it was built so very close to the river. The picturesque reflective qualities of the water was a feature that the architect, C.M. Barry, was very keen to exploit, and we can all agree how beautiful it looks in this image here. But the reason I want you to take note of it and how close it is to the water is that when we look at the present day situation a bit later on in my presentation, that positioning of the building so close to water actually causes us problems nowadays. So it was an artistic choice, which is really rather beautiful, but has left us with many logistical and practical problems today. Also, if you could take note of the clock tower at the far right, known as Big Ben, which actually refers to the name of the bell within. It's actually called the Elizabeth Tower, renamed in 2012 for the Queen's Jubilee. I'm pleased to tell you that if any of you have come to London in the past 3 years and been so disappointed because the tower has been covered in scaffolding, that's actually come down now, and the newly restored Big Ben Tower, or Elizabeth Tower, looks absolutely splendid and magnificent with its new gilding, and it looks really good. So please do, if you are in London, race to see it, because it's not covered in scaffolding anymore, which is really, really lovely to see. At the other end of the building, if you note the other tall tower on this structure, this is called the Victoria Tower. And it's where the Parliamentary Archives, which is a collection of scrolls dating from the 11th century, that's where they are actually housed at the moment. These archives, along with the furniture, paintings and furnishings within the palace or within the Houses of Parliament, form one of the most significant historic collections in the world, which, as we will see as we move through the presentation, need to be conserved along with the fabric of the building. So the following slides in this presentation they serve us tonight to gallop through nearly 1,000 years of building, monarchy, destruction and resurrection, and will bring us right up to the present day, where the UK government are now looking forward to the next chapter in the story of the Palace of Westminster, and what we have to do to make sure that this wonderful building is preserved for the next 200 years. So moving on to the next slide. There's been a royal palace on this site where the Houses of Parliament are since the early 11th century, but none of these earlier structures survive today. We know that these buildings would have been constructed of wood, as was the rest of London during that time, although there is some evidence of the reuse of Roman building materials such as stone and marble, pillaged from the desecration of Roman London that occurred during the 6th to 10th centuries. These examples are few and far between, so all we're left with is scant physical and documentary evidence of what this area was populated with in the early 11th century. What we do know is that London was one of several kingdom capitals, along with those in Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia, originating from the period before England was united into one country by King Athelstan in 929 AD. After this point, London became the recognised capital of the unified country, but it was situated around the old Roman centre, which was to the east, where today remnants of the Roman city wall, a Roman theatre and a Roman Mithraeum can still be seen, and they are on display to the public. So again, if you're ever in London, I highly recommend a trip to the city of London in the east to see those archaeological sites. During the reign of Edward the Confessor, which was 1042 to 1066, large-scale building in stone commenced in London, and it was this king who set his sights to the west of the city on an unassuming patch of marshland called Thorney Island. And again, this point about it being a marshland and a bit sort of unattractive is really key as to sort of why he decided to expand west. And the motives for this expansion could be attributed to Edward wanting to make his mark on the newly emerging England as a strong and powerful unified country, and ensuring that he made a public show of building on an epic and expensive scale to ensure that his people knew that he was fit for the task, and the whole cult of kingship was really there for all to see. It was Edward who built Westminster Abbey, which was completed in 1065 on Thorney Island, and also built a nearby palace on the stretch of adjoining land, but closer to the river, and that was completed just a few years later. The earliest depiction of both buildings is in the Bayeux Tapestry, which was created around 1077, and this is the image that you can see on the screen now. And this is a really key piece of evidence for us as historians and looking at the early history of London and especially Westminster, because it shows the death of Edward in the palace, which is to the right of the image, and the funeral procession in the middle, and then his burial place in the abbey to the left. So this one piece of evidence really speaks to us and shows us that there were two buildings there. They were significant structures at that time, And they had a geographical relationship to one another, as well as being significant processional and ceremonial buildings that could cope with the funeral of a king. So the Bayeux Tapestry in itself is a really interesting piece of history. It's one of the most significant records of medieval history that still exists. It's 70 meters long and 50 centimeters high, and it's been dated to around 1077. And two theories persist as to who was responsible for its creation. So one reasoning attributes it to Queen Matilda, who was the wife of William the Conqueror, and her ladies in waiting. And the other reasoning attributes it to William the Conqueror's unfortunately named half-brother, Bishop Odo, who actually once owned Eltham Palace that I used to curate. But regardless of the source, it can be considered a contemporary document depicting 58 scenes leading up to and throughout the Norman Conquest and Battle of Hastings in 1066. So for us, looking at the history of Houses of Parliament or the old Palace of Westminster, it really is key because these two buildings can be seen side by side there. After the Norman Conquest, the building of fortified castles in stone gathered momentum and was used as a real show of strength by the new Norman ruling classes who had taken over England. Probably the best example of this sort of building campaign is William the Conqueror's building of the Tower of London during the same period, and we all know how impressive that is. So you can imagine that the Norman rulers wanting to make their mark on England and make sure that everybody knew that they were in charge and they could do really magnificent things. So moving on to the next slide, the Abbey on Thorney Island came to be known as Westminster, literally west of the Minster in the City of London, which probably referred to the area that St Paul's Cathedral is now located. So on the site of St Paul's Cathedral, there's no actual evidence for a medieval religious building that exists now, but around the area there are various different suggestions as to where this minster in the City of London actually existed. And when the Abbey was built, because it was west of that area, it became known as Westminster. The new abbey dominated the area until 1097, when William Rufus, seen here, who was the son of William the Conqueror, embarked on his own building programme across London, which included the erection of the Great Hall at Westminster Palace. So before this point, although there was a palace on the site of Thorney Island, and it was directly opposite one of the ends of Westminster Abbey, it really didn't rival the size of the Abbey at all. It really was quite a meagre building in comparison. It was still impressive in its own right. But what William Rufus did, he decided to make it even more impressive, and he actually constructed a great hall there. His ambitious plans meant that Westminster Hall, as it's known today, measures 240 feet long and 67.5 feet wide. But when he saw it finished, he remarked, "It is not half so large as it should have been, and is only a bedchamber in comparison with the palace I intend to build," which I think, given the scale of it, as you can still see it today, it's still in its original scale, I think is a very sort of amusing quote from someone who had real sort of not delusions of grandeur, but had certain ambitions of grandeur. And you can see here this lovely illuminated manuscript illustration of Rufus holding Westminster Hall in his hand there. So it's a really wonderful little picture that gives an impression of his ego, if nothing else. However, despite his boast that it should have been twice as large and it's only a bedchamber at the moment, he never pursued the plans further, perhaps choosing instead to concentrate on his expansion at the Tower of London, which of course was built by his father, and perhaps due to a motive of improving upon and surpassing his father's great achievements there at the Tower of London. And of course, it all comes back to this cult of kingship and wanting to further his own reputation as a great king, a great monarch, and someone who would serve the country well in terms of empowerment and prestige and image to other countries, especially France at this time. During the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a massive increase in the number of stone defensive buildings to project a show of power from the new ruling Normans. One example being Leeds Castle in Kent, which Curt mentioned that I was curator at for 5 years. And that castle was built in 1119 and interestingly, continuously inhabited by private owners until the death of the last private owner, Lady Bailey, in 1974. So dotted around England, you can see a cacophony of Norman stone-built castles, defensive structures, making sure that they could impose their will on the local inhabitants in the surrounding countryside. So it's really quite an impressive phase in English sort of building history, that people learnt how to work with stone and learnt how to quarry and learnt how to transport it and managed to build these amazing structures that you can still see today. On the next slide, by the late 14th century, the abbey was still the dominant structure here, perhaps displaying the power of the church over and above that of government and the monarchy. Now, on this slide here, you can see two images. On the left there is quite an interesting sketch plan of the area at this time. And you can see there on the left-hand side, you can see the bulk of Westminster Abbey. And then perpendicular to it and nearer the river, you can see the Great Hall built by William Rufus, so enlarging the Palace of Westminster as it was. But one of the main differences I sort of like to point out with this image is that surrounding Westminster Abbey, you can see a really entrenched structure and a structure which has been there for a very long time and has had lots of supporting buildings sprung up around it. So you can see that there are buildings for the clergy and you can see lots of cloisters. So the whole complex was really a living, breathing entity. Whereas if you look towards the right and nearer the river with the elongated Westminster Hall there, you can see that it pretty much stands on its own. And at this stage, it really was still struggling to hold its own against the bulk of the abbey. So it wasn't until Richard II, who you can see here in the other image on this slide, and his dates are 1367 to 1400, that he was the monarch who enhanced the palace, and in particular the Great Hall, to an extent that I would argue has never been seen before in England. And what he did was really fascinating. On the next slide, you can see two images. One is a 17th century print of the roof of Westminster Hall, and the other is a modern day photograph of that same roof. So before 1370, the hall had been constructed with columns creating two side aisles that served to support the massive expanse of the roof structure, and by default created a visual barrier to experiencing the true size of the roof. So looking at that left-hand image, the earlier image there, you can sort of almost imagine the columns that would have supported the central arch of that roof. And you can imagine how it created a very church-like experience and created three separate aisles in that space, which visually certainly didn't take away from the height and the expanse upwards, but it didn't serve to give people a true impression of how vast the floor space was. And you can see here today that it's virtually unchanged from that earlier image. So what Richard II did, he increased the height of the walls to 90 feet. He inserted large, expensive windows and installed one of the greatest feats of medieval engineering, a hammer beam roof that you can see here in both these images. And as I've already said, the left-hand one is 17th century and the right-hand one is 21st century, showing you that it's largely unchanged from that building phase of 1370. Now, this type of hammer beam roof structure is self-supporting, with the immense weight of the English oak beams being dispersed through the hammers, which jut out from the walls. These and the curved supports dispersing the weight downwards through the stone walls instead of through the columns that used to be there and used to go straight to the floor. So I hope that rather jumbled explanation, I'm creating a sort of picture for you of how engineering wise it would have worked. So this innovative design championed by Richard II meant that the immense floor space was uninterrupted by columns, and must have been totally awe-inspiring to the populace entering that hall. And I can honestly say that even now, when you enter Westminster Hall, there is a moment of, oh my goodness, you know, this is a massive piece of engineering. But it's not only the technical aspect of it, and something that always strikes me when I walk in there. It was and still is highly decorative, with the carved angels on the end of the supports, and you can see them there clearly, more clearly in the left-hand picture. So these wonderful carved angels, perhaps suggesting that the whole roof was there by the grace of God, supported by the angels indeed. And also those beams, the whole structure is painted with Richard II's personal emblem of the White Hart, which is painted at intervals on the hammers, and the White Hart is, of course, a white deer. So you can really see from these two images side by side that its original appearance survives almost unchanged today. And it actually remains one of only 3 surviving medieval hammer beam roofs in existence today, the others being at Eltham Palace, again, site that I curated, and the other at Windsor Castle. But I would say that the hammer beam roof at Westminster Hall is by far the largest of these survivals, and really is one of the sites to see if you are ever in London, because it really is magnificent. Now, moving on to the next slide, the alteration of the Great Hall at Westminster Palace meant that the palace and abbey now matched in size and were of equal dominance on the land that was once known as Thorney Island. Now, this lovely image here, it was commissioned for English Heritage, so I must give them credit for this image. This shows you how the Palace of Westminster really is holding its own now against Westminster Abbey. And you can see there, just to the left, you can see the end of Westminster Abbey. And I should have put an arrow in to show the chapter house, which is jutting out there, the circular building, which is a really key part of Westminster Abbey. But the other elements there as well, you can now see that around Westminster Hall, on the Palace of Westminster site, there are lots more supporting buildings now. And this includes St Stephen's Chapel, which has been pointed out with an arrow, which became the principal chamber of lawmaking, and also the Jewel Tower down at the bottom there, which served to hold the King's personal closet and jewels. So again, you've got all these supporting structures that have sprung up, much like the Abbey complex next door. So it really was now holding its own against the Abbey across the road. So for 500 years now, the palace had been the principal royal residence used by the monarch, and had also become a place of government and parliament, with parliament meeting in the Great Hall from an early date and using many other buildings for enacting the laws of England. And as the English democracy, the democratic system became more complex and more laws were passed, obviously more and more space was needed for the people representing the people of England, and also housing things like the scrolls I mentioned earlier. Of course, by this point in 1512, or the late 15th century, sorry, we now have 400 odd years of scrolls to store. So we have all those storage requirements as well. And the Jewel Tower played a massive part in that. And a lot of these supporting buildings also played a part to support the democracy and the parliamentary actions of England. But in 1512, a fire destroyed the majority of the palace, with only the Great Hall and Painted Chamber surviving. And the Painted Chamber was situated parallel to St Stephen's Chapel, that's been pointed out here. So it's only those two parts that survived this fire of 1512. Now, in 1512, we know that Henry VIII had been on the throne for a few years by this point. And whilst he had been using the Palace of Westminster, after the fire, he decided that he preferred Greenwich Palace, and he used this as his main residence. So the Palace of Westminster was never used as a royal residence again after this point, after that fire. Now, moving on to the next slide, after the fire in 1512, and because it was never used as a royal residence again for the next 300 years, it's being used solely as a place of government and solely as a place of parliamentary debate and lawmaking and democracy. So what happens is we see a gaggle of buildings spring up around the bits that survived that fire of 1512. And what this does, it creates a maze of add-ons and architectural styles that are captured here in this print from 1829. Now, what's interesting about this, not only as an aside, sort of separate from this talk, but as you can see, the lovely figures in the foreground, there are some really beautiful aspects of costume that you can pick out there, and the horse and carriage, which is really delightful. But what I'd like to point out to you today is that in the background, at the back of all these buildings in the foreground, you can see the triangular end of Westminster Hall poking up there. And the artist here has even sort of coloured it in a dark colour to distinguish it from the later buildings in front. And these later buildings look like very much like Elizabethan and Jacobean buildings that have been sort of thrown up to respond to the needs of the work that was taking place in the Palace of Westminster, or Houses of Parliament, as it was sort of moving towards its new name at this point. And these buildings kind of got thrown up as and when required, no real thought to layout. And so it creates a maze, it creates a jumble, which wasn't really unusual for any sort of surviving medieval structure at this stage. They kind of get incorporated, fortunately for us today, and some get preserved because of this gaggle being built around it. So it's quite lucky, really. This is sorry, if you just go back one slide. So just as an aside, again, I'd like to point out that the way the Houses of Parliament or Palace of Westminster looked at this stage in 1829, it's really interesting to think about what sort of thing was going on in parliamentary lawmaking at that time. And it was this setting of buildings that in 1807 saw the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade legislation get passed. So that was 1807. And then a few years later, in 1833, it saw the passing of the actual Abolition of Slavery Act in England that year as well. So it just kind of serves quite a nice purpose to think about what was taking place in this rather unruly set of buildings at that time, and knowing that the long history of this site really was still doing incredible work, even though it wasn't the magnificent medieval complex that it once was. There was still wonderful things going on inside there. So on to the next slide. From this plan view of the Houses of Parliament at this mid or sort of early to mid 19th century stage, you can see that Westminster Hall still dominated the site, and it was still the main focus of the complex of buildings that had sprung up around it. So this is quite a nice sort of confirmation of that earlier slide, where you can see those buildings laid out in plan view. But you can also see that it really is quite confusing. Westminster Hall sits nice and square there, and then you've got a sort of run of buildings at one end of it that kick off at an angle up there, and then also a sort of nice straight perpendicular bit that sticks out at the bottom pointing towards the River Thames. And this is quite important because that run of buildings and the court to the left of that run of buildings are elements that still survive today, and they're considered very, very special aspects of the Houses of Parliament because they are survivors of what happened next. So in 1834, something terrible happened. Fire broke out just over 300 years since the first fire in 1512. And once again, the majority of the Palace of Westminster was destroyed. And this fire was so fierce and long burning that it allowed artists such as Turner to set up on the opposite bank and paint a record of the fire in progress. And you can see here that it really is a ferocious event. And you can see all the boats on the river sort of getting a look, and the smoke that must have consumed the local area. But what's most interesting is you can see the ghostly white form of Westminster Abbey in the background, almost sort of gloating over its great rival's demise after 800 years of putting up with it, blocking its view to the river. I know I'm sort of giving these buildings very personal sort of personalities, but it's just something about this image that really strikes me, that, you know, the palace, the sort of place of government has been destroyed, and yet there in the background the religious buildings stand strong, and you know, it's just quite a moving image in many ways. So moving on to the next slide, the aftermath of this fire was completely devastating. I mean, we've seen in recent years, especially here in England, we've had several historic buildings go up in flames, and it's completely devastating to the people who work there, the people who have lived around those buildings for a very long time. And of course, not too many years ago, Notre Dame in Paris went up in flames as well. And it's a very, very devastating event to anybody involved in a historic building. So we can only imagine what it must have been like for the parliamentarians, you know, local people, people who worked in this set of buildings, to watch it burn almost to the ground. And the plan on the right here, the plan, there's two images there. The plan on the left hand side of that slide shows greyed out everything that was destroyed. And once again, we have Westminster Hall. It doesn't get destroyed, quite possibly because of Richard II's wonderful work with raising the walls up to 90 feet. It may have served a purpose to stop the fire. Certainly what served as a fire break was the gaggle of buildings that burnt down. So the fire consumed itself with those buildings before reaching Westminster Hall. But as I mentioned before, that little sort of stick out run of buildings, as well as the court next to it, did survive the fire. And those are the parts that can still be seen in the Houses of Parliament today. Now, the image on the right of this slide is, again, quite a moving charcoal sketch of what the interiors of the palace looks like after this fire in 1834. And you can see there that it was absolute devastation. The roofs are completely gone. And before we set about this talk tonight, I had a good discussion with Curt actually about the reasons for roofs falling in. And roof timbers were all made out of English oak, you know, good thick bits of wood that actually take hours to burn through. But what happens is the stone walls beneath them, even though there is a misconception that stone doesn't burn, it does at a high enough temperature. But more importantly, the mortar that holds those stone walls together, or the brick walls together, that actually burns as well. So once the mortar is gone, you have a very, very unstable stone or brick structure. And then you have the colossal weight of the English oak beams pressing down on them with nothing to hold them together. And that's where you get roofs collapsing, because there's no structural integrity to keep them up. And you can see that charcoal sketch perfectly sort of displays that, where you've got these wonderful stone tracery interiors that have lost their roofs and are completely open to the elements because of this absolutely fearsome fire. So as part of the National Recovery Plan, a competition was launched to design a new Houses of Parliament to show that whilst the building might be gone, the concept of democracy and lawmaking lived on. And the winning architect in 1835 was a man called C.M. Barry, and he was appointed as the winning designer, and came up with this neo-Gothic fantasy that cleverly incorporated the remaining medieval structures that had survived, and forced them, I feel, into an ordered, squared off shape that almost masked the fact that the hall was not lined up with the river. And you can see here, this is a really wonderful plan. I love this one, where you can see that Westminster Hall wasn't parallel to the river. And so Barry has very cleverly, obviously, left it there. You can't move the medieval hall, but he's cleverly designed everything else so that when you're in the building, you don't realise that it's not lined up with the rest of the buildings. And that main corridor that goes from one end of Westminster Hall down to the octagonal hall, or central lobby as we know it today, you can see it's at a slight angle, but when you're in that space, you have no idea that it's not completely lined up with that corridor. So very clever man. Has been described as other things, I think, because his sort of neo-Gothic elements really sort of drove him a bit mad, to be honest. And when you're in the interiors of the Houses of Parliament, which were, of course, designed in conjunction with Barry. Pugin, the interior designer, also worked on the interiors, and it really is a very, very successful marriage of architecture and interiors done by those two wonderful designers. But the other parts of this plan highlighted in yellow, the most significant space is still in use today. So you've got the House of Commons to the far right, and then a lobby, and then you've got a corridor leading to the octagonal hall, or central lobby as we call it, another corridor, another small lobby, then you have the House of Lords, and then the Royal Gallery. So all those spaces are still in use today. And it's interesting to note that whenever you see on British news where something important has been going on there, and the TV journalists, TV reporters interviewing the MPs, they all stand in that central lobby in that octagonal hall, so you can see how wonderful it is. It's quite nice to tone out what they're saying about politics and enjoy the interiors instead. That's certainly what I do when I see them on TV anyway. But another interesting thing about this plan, if you look very closely, you can see that the new building encroached very, very much on the banks of the River Thames, a feature that started causing problems almost immediately that the building came into use, and certainly causes problems for those who look after it now. And that leads us nicely onto where we are now. So if we could have the next slide, please. So after nearly 200 years, the new Houses of Parliament, built in 1837, are now in need of some conservation and restoration. The proximity to the Thames that I just pointed out there has resulted in regular floodings of the basement levels and really nasty influxes of sewage, which is really unpleasant for anybody who works there, MPs, administrative people, reporters, journalists, anyone who works there has had some mishaps with leaks coming into the building. So it's not pleasant at all. What another interesting thing, and I find this absolutely fascinating, one of the brilliant innovative things that C.M. Barry designed was cast iron drainage pipes that were really cleverly secreted inside the walls so you couldn't see them. However, that now creates a problem because these pipes are corroding and causing leaks, but they can't be accessed because they're built into the walls. So we have quite a major problem there about how to dig them out without causing too much damage, reinstate them with some more appropriate material, and reinstate the fabric that's been disturbed to do that. So that's a major problem that's being faced at the moment. The wiring, which would have been completely modern at the time, and again, a real innovation, has been updated and added to so much over the years that there's miles and miles and miles of cabling, that it's a real jungle in the voids of the building. And, all this has to be dealt with. And it's got to the stage now where we're having to think about starting from scratch in a lot of places and ripping everything out and starting again. There's also, because of the cabling, the old cabling and leaks everywhere and things like that, there's a significant risk of fire at all times in all areas of the building. And they mitigate this very much so by having a lot of staff on duty, specifically to fire watch, which is fantastic. And as I've mentioned previously, we have examples of very devastating fires in historic buildings, and that's what everybody is so frightened of, and that's why they mitigate it with these fire watch teams all the time. So all of these problems with the Houses of Parliament led to a sort of working group that for the last 20 years or so has really been thinking about, right, how can we tackle all these problems with this wonderful building that is so iconic and must be preserved for future generations. And there's been much debate about whether it should be preserved, whether it should be made into a museum, should our MPs and lords sit there, should they be moved further up the country so they're more centralised. There's been so much debate about it that's still ongoing. But in 2012, a lot of different parliamentary papers got written and signed off about setting up a body to deal with the planning and delivery of the work that needed doing. And in 2019, finally, a Restoration and Renewal Delivery Authority and sponsor body was set up and given parliamentary approval to be created and go ahead and start planning and looking at and specifying what works were needed. Now, this setup is the result of many years of discussion, but we were lucky in the UK in that 2012 we got awarded the 2012 Olympics, and the structure, the governance structure of the Restoration and Renewal Delivery Authority and sponsor body is very much modelled on the sponsor body and delivery authority for the 2012 Olympics. So we had a model to work with. So governance wise, it was not unheard of to set up something like that. However, this is an organisation which has been tasked with planning for and providing options for a complete and thorough restoration and improvement of the Houses of Parliament so that it lasts for at least another 200 years, hopefully more, and so that future generations can enjoy this building as we have all done so far. So, as Curt said in the introduction, my involvement with the Restoration and Renewal Delivery Authority was being brought on as a heritage business analyst. That was my official title. And it was a fascinating, just over a year, I worked on the project. And it was a fascinating insight as to how complex projects of this scale truly are. And there are so many wonderfully clever, amazing people involved in this project. But one of the reasons why my very first slide says the Houses of Parliament or the Palace of Westminster 1086 to 2086 is because it may well take that long to get the work done on this wonderful complex of buildings. So I don't expect to see it happen in my lifetime, but I am so very, very privileged to have been involved in it for just over a year and to have contributed my skills and experience, you know, being a very, very small cog in a massive machine. And I hope that our next generations will be able to see the fruits of the labour of people that have come before them. And it's been a huge privilege to be able to talk to you about it today. And I'm very excited for any questions that get fired at me. So thank you very much for listening.
Wow, thank you, Annie, for that great presentation. We have a lot of questions already, but before we get to your questions, we have a few programs that shockingly involve me that I would like to mention. There is still time to sign up for my next class on British country houses and explosion of beauty, which takes place next Tuesday, February 21st. And then on March 10th, I will be giving a virtual presentation of the DiCamillo Companion Rendezvous that was held in person in New York City last month. And this, of course, will be about the crown jewels. So now let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the time provided. And I'm going to start off with the first one, which is, what was Westminster Hall originally used for? What was it designed for?
So it really was designed as a gathering place for you know, the lawmakers of the time. When it was first built, a great hall was used as a place of gathering. So in a more domestic setting, and I will use Elton Palace as this example because I know it very well. So the Great Hall at Elton Palace, much smaller scale, but again built as the major focal point of that that domestic setting where people could gather, where the owner of the property could hold audiences. So at Westminster Hall, this massive, great big hall, it really was a place for all the important men of the country, and I do mean men because at that stage it was, to gather together and discuss various things that were going on. Nowadays, of course, and what I failed to mention is that it still gets used as that gathering place. And as you know, very recently, Queen Elizabeth II passed away, and it was used as a lying-in state, and it's also been used as a lying-in state for various other royal personages. So it was originally sort of used and utilised as a gathering place to discuss lawmaking and other issues of the day.
Well, I'm very excited to say that Deborah in Surrey, that's the one in England, she makes it very clear that she's in England. She says, regarding the 17th century picture of Westminster Hall, that there was a wall or screen across the far end of the hall What was its function and when was it removed?
Yeah, so that screen, that's a really good question. I think these spaces have, and especially Westminster Hall, because it has been used for quite a lot of different ceremonial purposes at one stage or another in the hundreds of years that it's been used. There has been a screen erected at that end, and in that engraving, it looks almost like a liturgical rood screen that you would find in a church setting. And again, screens like that were used as we would expect today, to divide up a big space, to mark out the staircase at one end. And I believe that that image was looking towards the stairs that are at one end of Westminster Hall. So again, to mark out, it's a demarcation of where people can go, who can go where. So it's all very ceremonial and ritualistic, but really a simple answer is just to demarcate one space from another within a larger open space.
Lovely, thank you. Ruth would like to know, is the hall, by which I think she means Westminster Hall, where the monarch opens Parliament with a row of benches?
The opening of Parliament takes place in the House of Lords, so the Royal Gallery is used and the House of Lords is used, but Westminster Hall does get used for some gatherings of Parliament, but not as many as it used to be hundreds of years ago. So that in the plan where you saw the yellow marked out rooms, that is the main sort of processional route that is used now for state opening of Parliament. Rather than
I think Ruth is probably referring to when the Queen, as she was, sat on her throne, which would have been in the Lords. I'm pretty sure that's what she's thinking of, because that's what's always photographed at the state opening. And actually a follow-up to that is, what exactly is the Royal Gallery? What's it used for? What was it designed for?
So the Royal Gallery is where those thrones sit. So they don't actually sit in the House of Lords, because the House of Lords gather there on their own, but the Royal Gallery is where the thrones sit, so where the monarchs go, and it's next to the robing gallery, which the name sort of suggests itself, the robing, they get robed up in the robing gallery. And there's also a private staircase for the monarchs to go up as well into the Royal Gallery.
So does that, the thrones are moved from the Royal Gallery into the Lords before the state opening?
I think they're different ones that get moved into the Lords, because the ones in the Royal Gallery are massive. They're huge, whereas the ones that you see in the House of Lords, they're slightly smaller ones. Yeah.
Right. Jay would like to know what Anston limestone is.
Sorry, say that again.
Well, on the one of the slides you showed that gave sort of the modern, with the 240 miles of cabling, that slide, it said that this place was built out of Anston limestone, and I think he's asking, what is Anston limestone? ANSTON.
It's a type of stone. I can't give you the specific geological origins, I'm afraid. That's beyond my expertise, I'm afraid there.
I mean, I guess what I would ask, or what I think he might be asking is Anston a part of England where this limestone is mined? I assume it was English limestone that was used.
I'll have to have a look at that again, because I can't, I don't know where that is. Let me just see if I can find it on my printout, and I can perhaps.
And Jay, if we can't answer that question now, you by all means email us, and I'll give you the email just at the end. And when I hear back from Annie,
it must be a particular region in the UK that it comes from, but I have to confess I've never heard of it before, so I don't know.
That's lovely. We all love learning new things. Jay would like to know what what areas are open to the public and how is public access regulated?
What a brilliant question. That's something that I didn't cover. So anyone can go and visit. You have to book on, and obviously because of various terrorists and security incidents that we've had in recent years in the UK surrounding Westminster, there's a strict sort of protocol that you have to go through in order to book yourself on. So you have to prove your identity, etc., etc. But you can book onto a tour, so it's all guided tours, and that tour does encompass Westminster Hall and certain areas on that on the yellow highlighted rooms. So sometimes you can be taken through House of Commons, House of Lords, but it really depends on the activities of the day. And obviously, if there's a scheduled meeting of the Lords or Commons, you know, the tour won't take in that part of it. However, we have every Wednesday when Parliament is sitting, we have something called PMQs, which is Prime Minister's Questions. And you are allowed to book into that if you want to go and sit for hours and listen to them be horrible to each other. So, you know.
And if I'm not mistaken, you can actually go into Westminster Hall all by itself without having to go through the rest of the houses of Parliament.
Yes.
At least it used to be that way.
Yeah,
so,
you can.
And I don't think you require booking for that. I think you can just sort of show up and walk, because you can only go into the hall, you can't go into the rest, which is still amazing to see that space. Let's see here. Deborah would like to know if there are plans to move the Parliamentary Archives out of the Victoria Tower.
I think one of the things I sort of briefly mentioned, but didn't really go into it, was the fact that the different options for the restoration and works to the buildings as a whole. There were several different options papers that were presented with lots of different options, ranging from completely emptying everything, doing the work and moving everything back in, to trying to do the work with stuff and people still in there, and then sort of a hybrid model where zones would be decanted and then you know, worked on and reinstated and then move on to the next zone. In short, yes, things will have to be moved out in order to get works done. It's not something that they are releasing to the public yet about what their plans are, for obvious reasons. And I think there's still so much discussion going on, and it's such a complex, huge project that I think it will still be a few more years before we sort of are aware of any program of decanting things and you know, works actually starting, because it is such a big job and it has to be planned properly. And I think whilst I think in some quarters, you know, there's criticism over it taking so long to make decisions, I actually applaud the fact that they are making decisions with a thorough thought process behind it, because it is one of the most significant heritage projects that will ever take place. So yeah, there will be plans to move certain things, but I am not party to those plans and decisions at this stage.
Well, actually, sort of a follow-up on that, Ruth asks the status of the renovation or the restoration committee's output, and how has it been received by both the government and the people? That's a loaded question. And I have to say, as an addendum to that, 63 years is what you're basically saying from now before it will be completed, if it gets done in 2086. So let's put that all in perspective.
Yeah, I would hope that's on the longer end of the spectrum, to be honest. And I don't think actually any of the official options went up to that far. It's just that I always like to have a neat sort of, you know,
of course,
1,000 years or 500 years to my presentations. But as with all these things, because we are talking about taxpayers' money, it's been up, you know, it's constantly debated, and quite rightly too, that there's constant scrutiny over what should be spent and how it should be spent. And there are lots of wonderful headlines sometimes in the newspapers about, you know, the programme being up for review and it being talked about yet again. And I think there is a sense of exasperation. But as I said a moment ago, I actually think it's really healthy and really encouraging that the debate is still taking place, and there is scrutiny and there is oversight of everything that's going on, because it is so important to get it right. We've only got one chance at this.
Well, you know, one of the things that I know has been debated for years in the press, and I guess there isn't an answer to it yet, is will Parliament remain seated in the building while it's renovated, or will they move out and have it done more quickly and then come back in? And I assume that's something that's still under discussion.
It is, and I think what's really interesting is that this whole discussion and the planning started before the global pandemic hit. And what the global pandemic taught us as a you know, global people, is that we can work remotely. Now, there are certain jobs that can't work remotely, and being an MP is one of them, because you have to get together for certain things. And it goes back to the original purpose of Westminster Hall, you know, the gathering together and speaking in person. However, I think there are lots of different options that have been discussed, and I think there's lots of feeling about whether MPs should move out, whether MPs should go to the middle of the country or not, you know, relocate to Yorkshire or whatever might be the middle of the country. You can tell that geography isn't my strong point here. But, you know, I think there's lots of heartfelt opinions about what should and shouldn't happen. And I think whatever's decided, I'm confident that it will have been debated, and it will have, you know, the decision will have been made based on lots of different voices being heard, and you know, lots of different ramifications being thought about. So even if that final decision doesn't please some people, you can't please everybody, especially in politics. So
well, I think with that answer, we'll have to say you missed your calling. You should have been in the diplomatic corps. So Catherine wants to know, what is the condition of the decorative interiors and the woodwork?
Well, I think at the moment they're at the stage where they're doing lots and lots of condition surveys to understand the condition of interiors and fixtures and fittings and furnishings. Now, what's interesting about the House of Parliament, and especially the furniture collections, is that it's all used. It's all used. So all the wonderful pieces of furniture designed by Pugin, you know, those original pieces of furniture are used on a daily basis, and it's a wonderful thing. And yet for a conservator of historic objects, it's also an extremely scary thing, because you naturally want to, you know, conserve something and not let anybody touch it, and make sure it's there for years to come. However, we have to sort of stop ourselves and question the fact that, you know, this is a living, breathing, working building, and those collections that were specifically made for that building were intended to be used. So how do we preserve them to an extent which is as much as possible, and yet allow people to get their jobs done, and allow the whole concept of architecture and interiors to continue as it was intended by Barry and Pugin? And I think it's a really interesting debate, isn't it? Because, and I think it's much wider than this talk about the House of Parliament or Palace of Westminster. It's about conservation practices, and, you know, does a chair, oh goodness, I'm getting all philosophical here, aren't I? But does a chair, if we stick it in a display case, is it still a chair if no one's bum is sitting on it? I mean, I don't know. I've just opened up a can of worms, haven't I?
Yes, you have. Oh my goodness, this will be debate that will be going on for centuries. I'm going to take you to something that I think is hopefully easier to answer. An anonymous attendee asked, as part of this restoration, will there be any added protections to prevent flooding from the Thames?
Yes, so they are looking very much at making sure that the vulnerabilities of the 1837 building are fixed to as full an extent as possible. Now, when you build something so close to the river, you know, it's always going to be damp. Anybody, you know, I've always, as a curator, my office in any historic building has always been in the basement or the attic. So I'm either damp and frozen or hot and dry, you know.
It's always that way.
Why am I? Yeah, anyway. But, you know, I think there are fixes that are being thought about. And as I said, that, you know, there are the most wonderful engineers, programmers, you know, the most wonderful people involved in this project. And so you've got the best people working on solutions to make sure that the building is safe, not only from you know, people, but safe from environmental factors as well. And actually, sustainability, environmental sustainability, is something that I didn't mention. There is a massive drive to make sure that any works done are environmentally sustainable. Materials used, you know, supply lines, they all must be environmentally sustainable. And it's an excellent piece of work that's being done by that particular team there.
I think that's wonderful. And I feel that I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. Norman asked Annie very specifically if you can comment on the surprising deterioration of the exterior limestone of the building.
Yeah, well, I think pollution has a lot to do with it, to be honest. I've worked on several other buildings in London, The one that comes to mind is Apsley House, which is on Hyde Park Corner, the home of the Duke of Wellington. And
I'll interrupt and say another English heritage property that you were involved with.
Yes, and Wellington Arch, just in the middle of the roundabout there. But yes,
but isn't that Bath stone though? It's a different stone. It's Bath.
It is a different stone, but Bath stone and limestone, I mean, all these things are susceptible to the particulate pollution. And I think certainly it's to do with what we used to call in the 80s acid rain. I'm sure there's a newfangled term for it now, but the pollution from motor vehicles in and around London, and that's one of the reasons why the congestion charge was introduced, and now we've got this ultra low emission zone in and around London as well. And it is improving the air quality, and it is improving things like building deterioration, but it's happening not only on massive public buildings, but in Greenwich as well. I used to work a lot in Greenwich, and some of the beautiful houses down Crooms Hill, they were completely blackened by centuries of pollution, and once they got jet washed, which in itself can cause problems, so please don't all go home and get your jet washes out.
But, we all have jet washes in our closets, yes.
But the difference is incredible. So again, I'm not sadly I'm not a scientific environmental expert, so I can't go into granular detail about exactly what the problem is, but I do know that air pollution is a major factor in the deterioration of limestone.
And I would say, I'm guessing this is a particularly porous limestone, this Anson limestone that we're talking about, because anybody just look at photographs, color photographs from the 1960s. I mean, the Houses of Parliament are almost black with soot. I mean, that's the other thing not to forget is coal burning fires, which was now outlawed, but were the only way most people heated. And I'm sure, I mean, any building, not the House of Parliament, any building in London was black from all the soot and the pollution.
Very much so.
Elizabeth asked if any portion of the new King's coronation will take place in the Houses of Parliament.
There will be, I mean, what a spectacle it will be. I mean, if any of you watched the late Queen's funeral, what a spectacle of ceremony and ritual and protocol. It was truly humbling to watch. I felt myself. And with King Charles's coronation, there will be an equal amount of pomp and ceremony, although there are some reports in newspapers over here that it's going to be a toned down affair and not as grand as Queen Elizabeth's coronation, but that's speculation by the media, so who knows. But certainly the Houses of Parliament will play a key role in certain parts of the coronation. Obviously the coronation itself will take place in Westminster Abbey, but Westminster Hall will be a place of gathering as well. But I really, I'm not a parliamentary ceremonial historian, sadly. I used to work with Dr. Anna Kay, who is the yes. Dr. Anna Kay, don't you?
I do. Yes. But she's a Landmark Trust now, isn't she?
Yes, she is. So she is very up to speed on what will happen and what won't happen. Perhaps get her to do a talk.
Well, that is a lovely idea. She's a very good presenter. I've been talking when I was over in December to two peers who were saying how disappointed they were that they were not going to be able to wear their coronets and their robes, because apparently, according to them, and this has been confirmed to me very recently by someone in the royal household, there will be no coronets worn at this coronation.
Really?
And the other thing that I didn't know, I was just told recently, is that all peers will not be invited. Because in an attempt, which I think is lovely, in an attempt to make it more egalitarian, Charles wants to invite people from all walks of life, and there obviously is limited seating in Westminster Abbey. So certain peers will be invited and certain peers will not, which I think will be very interesting to see.
Yeah,
There'll probably be riots.
I think it's very interesting how the conversation is moving towards a very, very inclusive, it's an inclusive tone nowadays, which is wonderful. And, going back to the question about where will the MPs go? Will they go geographically to the middle of the country? I think it's wonderful to even start talking about that rather than just make the assumption that we're going to stay
I
down
agree, but you know that's never going to happen. They'll never leave
do,
London.
but you know, I'm forever.
But I think, well, I'm not going to say Yorkshire. I think we should be fairer and say the Midlands and say Derbyshire. Let's move them to Derbyshire. That way they can actually meet and have lunch at Chatsworth. We actually have an answer. I'm sure I'm saying your name properly. Branwyn Kennedy. She says, I found this, quote, the Palace of Westminster was built with a sand-colored limestone from the Anston Quarry in Yorkshire.
Oh.
In 1839, a committee, including the architect Charles Barry, 2 leading geologists, and a stone carver, toured the country looking at quarries and buildings. Anston stone was chosen because it was cheaper, of course, and could be supplied in blocks up to 4 feet thick and lent itself to elaborate carving. Of course, the thing I will say about the carving part, that should always be a giveaway. If it's easy to carve, it's soft. And if it's soft, it doesn't last as well. So the 2 things are here: that it's cheap and it was easy to carve, and that's future generations are paying for that. Now, I think more than one person has mentioned, and I'm not sure if they're talking or they're just asking, was the recent reception for President Zelensky of Ukraine, was that held in Westminster Hall or at another part of the Houses of Parliament?
Do you know, I have no idea, because I heard it was happening. I didn't read anything about it. I didn't see any pictures. You know, I was too busy getting excited about coming to Malta, I'm afraid. So I honestly, I cannot tell you what happened there. Do apologize.
Well, now here's something that I love. Mary Ann says, speaking on the history of limestone, that one of my favorite buildings in the world, and Annie, if you haven't been, we have to take you to Philadelphia. This is the Philadelphia Museum of Art,
Yes,
which is the largest Greco-Roman building in the world. So she says that the Anston limestone is very similar to the limestone from Minnesota that was used to build the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is interesting. If you look at it from the outside, it has a sort of a color. It's a better color than the Houses of Parliament limestone. It's more of a bath color. It's a warm honey color, but it's very porous. It has like almost like travertine, like those little holes that you find in it, but it's aged very well. I mean, it's only 100 years old, but it's funny because if it is a similar makeup, and obviously it's a similar limestone, I wonder why the Philadelphia Museum of Art has aged much better than, I'm sure pollution has to do with it too, also being a more recent building. But I just say there's so many wonderful things going on here. I'm going to end with one last question. Was the land expanded out into the Thames? And I think this means, if you look at the early illustrations, it looks like Westminster Hall is right on the Thames, like it's parallel with it. And in today, it's much further removed, and we have the Houses of Parliament in front of that. Was it possible the land was filled in to accommodate that?
Yeah, definitely part of it was, and it happens all along the Thames. In fact, I was reading about another part just along from there. So the Victoria Gardens, just by Embankment Station as well. The Thames, I mean, rivers of that size naturally move course over the space of hundreds of years. Anyway, so part of it is natural movement, but definitely there was filling in, and that again causes problems such as subsidence if it's not done robustly enough. So definitely the course of the Thames has been sort of tinkered with for a lot of building projects along it to try and grab more land or make a nice inlet or something. So very, very much so.
And I think that leads us to a perfect statement of, it's important to remind people that the Thames has for hundreds and hundreds of years regularly flooded. And I think the most recent horrible flood was in the 1920s. And that's why the Thames Barrier was built, I think, in the 1980s, is that right? And that Thames Barrier is now at the outside of its useful life and will have to be replaced. So the thing to remember is, just without any floods at all, it's a problem. And then when you subject floods, and I mean floods, I mean like we're talking 6 to 8 feet of water in the streets of London. So it's like most cities, built on water for a reason, for navigation, but it also makes it very subject to all kinds of nastinesses as life develops. That is sadly all the time that we have for questions today. You can always email us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. And we will answer any questions we can that we weren't able today and forward them on to wonderful Annie. Thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.